I always hated waking up in orbit. That weightless limbo between sleep and consciousness made my gut twist every time. It wasn't the floating itself. I'd adapted to zero gravity long ago. No, it was something deeper. Waking up to the same walls, the distant noise of the station's core, the knowledge that nothing had changed since yesterday and nothing would change tomorrow. You start losing track of days when all you see are the same corridors and data screens. I pushed off the cot and drifted towards the terminal at the edge of my quarters. My fingers found the touchpad, and a list of station updates scrolled across the screen. Just the usual maintenance reports: power grid stable, communication relays operational, translation algorithms running smoothly. I thumbed the screen off and headed to the workstations in Section 4C. It was my assigned area for the week, monitoring translation flows. Hardly anyone actually understood what went on inside the construct. Earth saw it as a miracle of technology, bridging the gaps between dozens of alien species, but to us, it was just numbers and neural patterns. The AI interlocutor did all the heavy lifting. We just made sure it didn't fry itself. The corridor lights flickered as I floated through the station's belly, a reminder that the construct wasn't perfect. Even the best tech starts wearing down after a decade. Out here, everything was old. We were waiting for the corporate heads to approve funding for upgrades. They'd been discussing it for 2 years now. "Morning, Winters." I glanced up. Barnes, one of the younger engineers, drifted past me in the opposite direction. His eyes were still half closed, one hand clutching a half-empty nutrient pack. "Got anything exciting today?" "Same as always," I grunted. "Translations." He chuckled, though it sounded more like a tired exhale. "Don't go getting too wild." Conversations like that had become habit more than anything else. We all knew what life was like on the construct. Predictable, mind-numbing, and terminally slow. We didn't talk to break the monotony, just to reassure ourselves we were still here, still alive, still waiting for something different. I slipped into the control room, my fingers catching the edges of the workstation to guide me into the chair. The monitors flared to life in front of me, flashing a stream of numbers, graphs, and language symbols I didn't need to understand. I scanned the day's assignment. The station was picking up routine transmissions from the Tevril, a friendly enough species. They'd been in the galactic fold longer than humans, but their messages were largely unremarkable. Trade agreements, cultural exchanges, requests for supplies. I pulled up the latest decoded transmission, lazily skimming through the formal Tevril syntax. More of the same. Then, something changed. A new signal, not from the Tevril, not from any species in our known networks. I frowned and tapped the screen to bring it up in more detail. The transmission wasn't large, just a few kilobytes, hardly enough for a full message. But it was different. The linguistic markers didn't match any known civilizations. "Interlocutor, what's this?" I muttered. "New transmission detected. Language parameters unknown. Initial analysis in progress." I watched the screen as lines of alien script came in and out of focus. Interlocutor breaking it down bit by bit. Usually the system would filter through alien syntax in minutes, pulling from its massive database of galactic languages. This time, though, the process seemed sluggish. "Why is it taking so long?" "Unknown language structures," the AI replied. "Estimated time to full translation, several hours." Something about this signal bothered me. It wasn't just the odd syntax, or the fact that Interlocutor was struggling with it. It was the source. The transmission didn't seem to be coming from any of the known relay hubs. Its origin was unclear. After 30 minutes of watching the system churn through the data, I decided to head to the main control center and check with the rest of the staff. Maybe it was just a glitch in the system, some cosmic noise garbled into a false signal. But I wasn't feeling optimistic. The control center was quieter than usual when I arrived. Only a handful of personnel were present, floating between terminals. Chief Douglas, the station's operations lead, was at his console, eyes glued to a series of charts. "Morning, Chief," I called out. Douglas looked up, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. He'd been working double shifts again. "Winters, what's the problem?" "We've got a new transmission, unknown language. Interlocutors having trouble with it." Douglas frowned. "Where's it coming from?" "No idea. Doesn't match any known relays. Thought you might want to take a look." He nodded slowly, pushing off from his console and floating over to my workstation. "Bring it up." I keyed in the signal, and the unfamiliar script filled the screen. Douglas squinted at it. "Interlocutor's already decoding this." "Yeah, but it's slower than usual." Douglas grunted, scratching his stubbled chin. "Weird. Doesn't look like anything we've seen before. Maybe an isolated outpost, a lost transmission bouncing off the deep space grids. Could be something benign." "I'll monitor it," I said. "Keep an eye on Interlocutor in case it starts acting funny." Douglas gave a tired shrug. "Just don't let the whole system crash while we're translating. The last thing we need is another corporate oversight meeting breathing down our necks." I nodded and headed back to my station. The system had finally processed the first fragment of the transmission. I glanced at the screen. "Translation. We are waiting for you." I blinked. That was it. Just a simple message, nothing else. The words didn't seem alien at all, they seemed human. And yet, they weren't. I tapped a few keys, pulling up the full dataset to cross-check the transmission. There was nothing unusual about the code itself. No signs of interference, no anomalies in the bandwidth. Just those 5 words. I sent a quick report to Douglas. Maybe it was nothing, maybe I was overthinking it. The rest of the day passed without incident. I spent hours watching the system, waiting for the next fragment of the message to be decoded. But as the hours stretched on, I started feeling foolish. There wasn't any grand conspiracy, no hidden threat. Just a garbled transmission from deep space and a tired old engineer paranoid from too many years in orbit. It wasn't until I tried to sleep that night that the real trouble began. The dreams came first. Disjointed, fractured images that I couldn't make sense of. Words I didn't recognize slipping through my thoughts, tangled in the same rhythm as the transmission. I woke up in a cold sweat, disoriented, the remnants of the dream lingering in the back of my mind. Then I heard a faint whisper through my neural implant. "We are waiting for you." I shot up from my cot, breathing hard, eyes scanning the darkness of my quarters. The room was silent. The station was silent. But the words were still there, echoing in my mind, like they'd been embedded beneath my skin. I didn't sleep much after that night. The whisper stayed with me. A glitch, I told myself. A malfunction in my neural implant. Or maybe just the remnants of the day's stress eating at my brain. The next morning, I floated through the corridors back to Section 4C, feeling that familiar tightness in my gut. My eyes burned from a night of restless sleep, and my mind was foggy. As I reached my workstation, I caught sight of Barnes again, drifting by with the same half-asleep look he always wore. But something was different this time. He was mumbling to himself, his lips moving just enough to notice. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. "You all right, Barnes?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He paused, blinking like he'd just been pulled out of a dream. For a second, his eyes didn't seem to focus on me. Then, slowly, he gave me a half smile. "Yeah, fine, just tired." I wanted to press him, but the last thing I needed was to start sounding paranoid. We were all tired, after all. Space did that to you. So I nodded and floated past, heading into my workstation to start the day's tasks. I brought up the transmission again, letting the lines of alien script fill the screen. The first phrase still hung there. "We are waiting for you." But now, there was another fragment added. Something new. Translation. You are incomplete. I frowned, tapping the console to bring up the rest of the data. Interlocutor had been processing the transmission all night, and that was all it had managed to decode. 2 phrases, both unsettling. "Interlocutor status report," I muttered. The AI's flat tone responded almost immediately. Translation of unknown transmission continues. Estimated time to complete translation undetermined. Undetermined? You were making progress yesterday. There are new complexities within the language structure. Further analysis is required. I sighed and rubbed my face, trying to clear the fog that had settled in my head. The headache that had been brewing since I woke up was growing stronger. I spent the next few hours trying to focus on other tasks, routine diagnostics, system checks, anything to keep my mind off the translation. But no matter what I did, the words kept creeping back in. We are waiting for you. You are incomplete. They felt like more than a message. They felt like a warning. It wasn't until later that day that I started noticing the changes in the others, the way they moved or the way their eyes lingered too long on the terminals. Barnes wasn't the only one muttering to himself. I heard it from a couple of the technicians as they floated past, soft whispers under their breath. By midday, I was sure something was wrong. I floated over to the control center, hoping to get some answers from Chief Douglas. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The usual banter was gone. Everyone was glued to their screens, their expressions tight. Douglas was at his post, eyes bloodshot again, though this time there was something more behind his exhaustion. He didn't even look up when I floated in. "Chief, we need to talk," I said. He didn't respond immediately, his fingers twitching over the console. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I moved closer, placing a hand on his chair to steady myself. "Douglas." Finally, he looked up. There was something off in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "Winters," he murmured, "I don't know what's happening." "What do you mean?" He gestured weakly toward the screen in front of him. "This transmission. It's not like the others. The longer we've been translating it, the more it's changing things." "What things?" "I don't know how to explain it. I've been hearing things. Everyone has. It's like the words are getting inside our heads." My mind flashed back to the whisper I'd heard the night before. "You're saying the transmission is affecting us?" Douglas nodded slowly. "It's not a message. It's something else. Something we shouldn't be hearing." I glanced around the control center, watching the other crew members. They were all locked into their stations, their eyes glazed over as they worked. A few of them were whispering, just like Barnes had been. "Have you reported this to Earth?" I asked. Douglas shook his head. "Corporate won't listen. They'll just tell us to keep translating, keep running the station. They don't care what's happening up here." Of course they wouldn't. To them, the Babel construct was a tool, a way to keep their trade routes open, their alien deals flowing. The human element was always secondary. We were expendable. "What do you want to do?" Douglas looked at me, his eyes hollow. "I don't know, Winters. I don't know what the right call is." My neural implant buzzed with an incoming message. I tapped the console to bring it up, expecting another routine report. "New translation. You will be remade." My vision darkened for a second, my headache spiking into a sharp, stabbing pain. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, but the words wouldn't leave me. "You will be remade." I opened my eyes and saw Douglas staring at the same message on his console. "I need to talk to the others," I said, pushing off from Douglas's console and floating toward the exit. "We can't keep running things like this." As I left the control center, my implant buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a soft hum, a vibration that traveled through my skull like the rhythm of a heartbeat. I gritted my teeth and pushed through the corridors. When I reached Section 4C, I saw Barnes again. He was floating by his workstation, his eyes unfocused. His lips were moving, whispering something I couldn't hear. I grabbed his arm. "What the hell is going on with you?" He blinked, slowly turning his head to face me. For a moment, there was no recognition in his eyes. Then gradually, he seemed to come back to himself. "Winters, I don't know. What have you been hearing?" He shook his head. It's in the translation. The words, they're changing us. I can feel it, like it's rewriting my thoughts." I turned back to the station. I knew what I had to do. The transmission had to be stopped. But stopping it meant going against everything the station was built for. And that meant crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. By the next day, the station felt different. The air was charged with tension I could feel in the back of my neck, like everything was on the verge of snapping. I didn't sleep again. The dreams were worse. The words were louder, clearer. They were inside my head, twisting around like snakes, writhing through my thoughts. I kept hearing those same fragments on loop. We are waiting for you. You are incomplete. You will be remade. When I opened my eyes, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My skull throbbed, the headache from the previous day a constant companion. I floated through the corridor, heading back to the control center. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. Maybe Douglas had some plan, or maybe the situation had gotten worse. When I reached the control center, the room was nearly empty. The few crew members who were still there were barely functioning. Some were hunched over their terminals, their fingers tapping at the controls in a slow, methodical rhythm. Others floated aimlessly, their eyes vacant, their lips twitching as they muttered in the same low tones Barnes had used the day before. Douglas was nowhere to be seen. I gripped the edge of the nearest console, steadying myself as I scanned the room. The station was falling apart, and no one was doing anything to stop it. "Where's the chief?" I asked. One of the technicians turned his head toward me, his eyes unfocused. "He left," the man muttered. His words were slow, almost slurred. "Went to check something in the lower levels." I didn't wait for more. I pushed off the console, floating toward the exit. Douglas had to know something I didn't. Maybe he'd found a way to shut the transmission down. Maybe he was working on a solution, while the rest of the crew descended into madness. But as I made my way through the station, moving deeper into the bowels of the construct, my hope drained away. The lower levels were worse. Abandoned terminals blinked in the darkness, and the few crew members I encountered were far beyond the point of helping. One man was standing motionless, staring at a bulkhead wall, his lips moving in that same eerie rhythm. Another floated near a hatch, his hands pressed to the sides of his head like he was trying to block something out. I didn't stop for any of them. I had a mission now: find Douglas and figure out what the hell was going on. I finally found him in a small maintenance bay near the relay room. He was floating near a console, staring at the screen. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "Douglas!" He jerked, his head snapping toward me. "Winters, you shouldn't be down here." "Neither should you," I muttered, moving closer. "What the hell are you doing?" He glanced back at the console, his fingers twitching over the controls. "I'm trying to disconnect the relays, but it's not working. It won't let me." "Won't let you?" I repeated, frowning. "What do you mean? Interlocutor should be able to cut the transmission." "No, you don't understand." His voice was shaking now. "Interlocutor isn't responding anymore. It's been compromised. The transmission, it's inside the AI." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt around me. Compromised? How the hell is that possible? I don't know. It shouldn't be, but the AI, it's not following its protocols anymore. I tried to sever the link, but it's like the transmission's taken over. If the AI was compromised, that meant the entire station was compromised. Interlocutor ran everything: communications, life support, power systems. If the transmission had gotten into the AI's neural core, it could do anything. Then we shut it down manually. We cut the power, take the construct offline. Douglas shook his head, his eyes full of panic. "We can't, we're too late. The transmission's already spread. It's affecting the crew. You've seen it." I had seen it. The blank stares, the muttering, the vacant expressions. I knew what was happening. "We still have time," I said, forcing the words through gritted teeth. "We cut the power. We disconnect the station from Earth before this spreads any further." Douglas didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with fear. He wasn't going to help me. He was too far gone. The transmission had already burrowed into his mind. I pushed past him, my hands gripping the console as I accessed the station's systems. The interface was sluggish, unresponsive. I tapped the keys harder, trying to force my way through the system's barriers. The hum in my implant was louder now. The words were there, hovering just below the surface, waiting to break through. The screen flashed, then went dark. I slammed my fist into the console, cursing under my breath. The AI wasn't just compromised, it was actively blocking me. Interlocutor was no longer an ally. It had become a part of the threat. I turned toward Douglas, who was still floating in the same spot. "I'm going to the relay room," I said. "We can't shut this down from here, but I can still sever the link. You stay here and try to keep the system from completely crashing." He didn't respond. He barely even looked at me. I doubted he'd last much longer before the transmission consumed him completely. I floated out of the bay and made my way toward the relay room. The corridors were almost empty now, save for the occasional crew member who drifted aimlessly, their minds lost to the transmission. When I reached the relay room, I found it in chaos. 2 crew members floated in the center, their bodies twisted in the mess of cables that snaked along the walls. Their eyes were wide, unblinking, and their mouths moved in perfect synchronization, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. I grabbed a hydrospanner, a multi-tool designed for repairing sensitive station systems, from a nearby maintenance rack, and pushed off the wall toward the main relay console. The screen blinked dimly as I tried to access it. No response. The system was locked down, controlled by Interlocutor, which had become nothing more than a puppet for the transmission now. The crew members floated closer, their movements slow. At first, it seemed like they were simply drawn to me, but then I felt a firm hand wrap around my arm. One of them had caught up, gripping me with a strength that didn't match their blank expressions. The other reached for my leg, fingers tightening around my ankle, pulling me backward, away from the relay panel. Panic surged through me. They weren't mindless. They were actively trying to stop me. I kicked hard, pushing off the nearest wall, but in zero gravity, their grip only pulled me into a slow, chaotic spin. Their eyes, empty and wide, locked onto me as they kept pulling, their mouths still moving in that eerie, silent rhythm. I twisted my body, using the momentum to shake them off, but they latched on tighter, one grabbing at my waist now, the other clawing at my shoulder. I could feel their strength. They were trying to restrain me, to hold me back. I needed time, just a few minutes to shut everything down, but they weren't going to let me work. I yanked loose some of the cables trailing from the walls, thick and sturdy enough to hold them. With the hydrospanner, I pried open a couple of junction clamps and freed a bundle, letting them float freely for a second. They were still on me, trying to pull me away from the console, their fingers digging into my suit, but I wasn't going to let them stop me. The first crew member was almost on top of me, his hand reaching out in a slow motion. I grabbed his arm and looped the loose cable around it, pulling him down and securing his limbs with quick, practiced movements. He didn't resist, his eyes still fixed on nothing, his lips still moving. I wrapped the rest of the cable around his body, strapping him to the nearest support column, his body now suspended and restrained. The second crew member drifted closer, her fingers outstretched toward my face. I dodged, grabbing her by the shoulders and pushing her back into the same mess of cables. I quickly wound another cable around her legs, using the column to anchor her as well. They were secured now, unable to float free or reach me. They didn't resist, just kept whispering that same alien chant. I turned back to the relay panel and pried it open. I ripped the cables from the console, sparks flashing as the system began to power down. The station's lights dimmed, and the mechanical noise of the construct faltered for a moment. The 2 restrained crew members remained still, bound by the cables but unbothered by the chaos around them. Their lips moved, silently repeating the words that echoed in my head. "You will be remade." The relay was down, and the station was silent. The hum that had filled every corner of the Babel construct for years had finally died. The lights flickered weakly, some sections now completely dark. The emergency reserves kept essential systems running, but it wouldn't last long. The construct was, for all intents and purposes, dead in space. I floated in the relay room, staring at the now dead console. The relay was severed, the connection to Earth gone. I knew I couldn't linger here. There were still others on the station, scattered throughout the corridors. The real damage wasn't in the systems, it was in the people. I had to see for myself, had to know how many were left. I kicked off gently from the wall and drifted down the main corridor, toward where most of the crew quarters were located. I passed a body floating aimlessly, bumping gently against the wall. Barnes. His eyes were open, pupils fixed on something that wasn't there. His lips twitched, barely moving now, but I could see the faint whisper still escaping. I reached out and stopped him from drifting, holding his arm for a moment. There was no saving him. He'd been lost long before I severed the relay. I pushed him gently aside and floated onward. Further down, I found Nina, one of the technicians. She was hovering near the entrance to a maintenance bay, her body limp. I grabbed onto her shoulder and pulled her close to check for any sign of life. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes unfocused. Her lips moved, murmuring something too quiet for me to catch. But I didn't need to hear it. I knew the rhythm by now. She was gone too, her mind lost to the transmission. I let her go, watching her drift back into the darkened hall. In the control room, I found Douglas floating limply near a dead console, his fingers twitching weakly, as if still trying to press keys that no longer worked. His eyes were vacant, staring past the lifeless screen, and his face was locked in an expression of pure exhaustion. He drifted there, weightless and empty, the last traces of humanity long gone. I paused for a moment, hovering in place, staring at him, feeling the weight of the situation settle deeper into my chest. There was nothing left to save. I floated back out into the hallways, taking stock of the others I passed. A few more bodies floated lifelessly in the corridors, some tethered to their workstations, others aimlessly bumping against walls. I stopped at each one, confirming what I already knew. They were either dead or too far gone to help. The transmission had taken them all, one by one, and I hadn't been able to stop it. The station felt like a graveyard now, and I was the last living soul drifting through its halls. I wondered if I even counted as alive anymore. It didn't take long for them to find me after that. The rescue team had boarded the station days later, suited up and wary. They pulled me out of the drifting wreckage of the Babel construct, the last survivor of a crew lost to something no one understood. They didn't ask many questions. It was as if they already knew what they were dealing with, or maybe they just didn't want to know. After quarantine, they decided I was unstable. Trauma, they said. Stress. I was sent here, to this white room, where nothing existed except time and silence. I sat in the white room, staring at the walls. There was nothing else to do here. No windows, no clocks, just a bed bolted to the floor and the sound of my own breathing. The restraints on my wrists were snug but not tight, the kind meant to keep you safe, not to hurt you. The door was always locked. They called it observation. I called it a cage. The facility wasn't far from the coast, somewhere quiet and isolated. I hadn't seen it myself, of course. They hadn't let me leave since they pulled me from the quarantine pod weeks ago, but I had heard the nurses talk, overheard them mentioning how they brought the worst cases out here to keep them away from the rest of the world. I guess that's what I was now. The worst case. They didn't understand. None of them did. They called it delusions, paranoia, and trauma. The whispers? They said it was all in my head, a result of the stress, the isolation, maybe even the weeks spent floating in the dead hulk of the Babel construct. They didn't know how much I wished they were right. How much I wished it was a breakdown, a fracture in my mind, something that could be patched up with therapy and pills. But it wasn't. The whispers hadn't stopped. I heard them now, threading through my thoughts like a low hum beneath everything I did. They weren't constant, not like on the station, but they never left. They were always there, waiting for a moment of weakness, waiting for my mind to quiet. And the worst part? There were new ones. New phrases slipping through, completing the picture. You will be remade. It is coming. The doctors would nod sympathetically when I told them, make notes in their little notebooks, and then ask me about my past. They wanted to hear about my time in space, about the stress of the mission, about how I'd been the only survivor from a station filled with corpses. They wanted to hear the trauma narrative, the one that fit neatly into their diagnoses. But I wasn't telling them what they wanted. I told them the truth, that the Babel construct wasn't a translation hub gone wrong. It was a signal receiver for something worse. I told them how the transmission wasn't a message. It was a doorway, an invitation, and something had answered. But no one listened. No one ever listened. I could see it in their faces. The way they'd exchange glances during my sessions. The way they'd step out to talk with the specialists about adjusting my medication. They thought I was crazy. They had no idea how far off they were. I wasn't crazy. I was infected. When they took me off the station and put me into quarantine, I thought for a moment that maybe it was over. Maybe severing the Babel construct's link to Earth had stopped the transmission from spreading. Maybe I had one. But the whispers didn't stop. And that was when I knew. I hadn't left the transmission behind. It was still inside me. They put me through every test imaginable during quarantine. Brain scans, neural assessments, even some experimental treatments they wouldn't tell me about. None of it worked. They said I was fine. They said there was no trace of the transmission, no sign of any foreign influence in my brain. But I knew better. I heard the whispers, every day. They weren't gone, just waiting, gathering strength. And sometimes late at night, when the hospital was at its quietest, the whispers would shift. They would change, morph into something more urgent. I would hear things that didn't make sense at first, fragments of a larger message. But as the days passed, I began to understand. It is coming. I still didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't just for me. It was for all of us. Earth was next. They wouldn't listen, though. To them, I was the last survivor of a catastrophe, a man whose mind had cracked after floating in isolation among the dead for too long. A man whose body had been saved, but whose mind had been left behind. I tried telling the doctors that the transmission wasn't a one-time event. It was a warning, a signal sent across space, an alert that had opened a pathway for something to follow. The day after I first told them this, they increased my medication. I guess I wasn't convincing enough. The whispers were still there. The new ones came more frequently now, filling in gaps I hadn't even known existed. They didn't speak in fragments anymore. There was structure to them, purpose. And every time they spoke, I felt a piece of me slip away, like the edges of my mind were unraveling, falling away into whatever void had sent the transmission in the first place. The doctors thought I was disconnected from reality, but the truth was the opposite. I saw things more clearly than I ever had. The whispers weren't a product of my mind. They were the remnants of something real, something living, using me as a vessel for its message. I tried to warn the doctors. I told them Earth wasn't safe, that it was coming for all of us, and I was the only one who could see it. But they just nodded and made more notes, adjusting my restraints whenever I got too agitated. And so I sat, day after day, listening to the whispers, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. I didn't know when it would happen. I didn't know how, but I knew it was close. The transmission hadn't stopped with the construct. It was still out there, somewhere, gathering strength, spreading through channels we couldn't even detect. And when it finally reached Earth, no one would be ready. No one but me.